we're going to get started with the second panel. Okay, thank you so much. So, okay. So my name is Alicia Webb, and I'm in my third year here at Northwestern, double majoring in legal studies and African American studies. And we have with us Andrew Golden, class of 2021. Gretchen McLennan, class of 97. Tori Stuckey, class of '04. And Dana Nixon, class of 2011. And so I know when I started at Northwestern, I actually did not intend to be an African American Studies major, but my freshman year, I took a class with Professor Kiana Ross called Education for Black Liberation, which introduced me to things like Black radical feminism, intersectionality, restorative justice, and so many concepts that I'd never come across before in my studies. And I immediately fell in love with the African American Studies classes because they made me realize how expansive Black Studies truly is. And so I'm truly appreciative of the African American Studies Department and Mary Patillo for putting this event together for us today. And so first we'll start with Andrew Golden. So he is a recent graduate, now a sports reporter at the Washington Post. He graduated with a double major in journalism and African American Studies and earned honors in African American Studies after writing his senior thesis on racialization and masculinization of Althea Gibson and Serena Williams in sports media. And so my question for you is, you graduated with a degree from Medill and a major in AFAM. What made you add the African American Studies major, and what was it like going between your classes in Medill and AFAM, and how are they the same or different? Did you have any models for this combination?
Yeah, so I always knew with journalism that I wanted to supplement it in some secondary way. I just didn't really know how I wanted to do that. I thought I wanted to do I took French in high school and thought I was going to do that in college, and I realized very, very quickly that wasn't going to happen. So I just kind of was looking at a bunch of classes online. In the winter, I took an African American Studies class with Professor Tracy Von Manley. I don't know if she's in here or not, but if you're taking a class with her, if you're in there for a couple of weeks and you feel like you've completely changed the way you think about everything, and that's how I felt. And for me, I wanted my second major to be a place where I felt like I was at home. And with Professor Von Manley, I kind of felt like home. Home was feeling loved and supported, but also feeling challenged. And I felt like I had that with Professor Von Manley. And I took a class with her, and after that, it was pretty simple for me to stay in. I just kind of kept taking classes and thought they were interesting. And then she was like, you can minor in this. And I was like, okay, cool. And I minored in it. And then I finished my minor sophomore year, and I was like, well, maybe I should just keep going. And I ended up majoring in it. So definitely a great experience. And it was really easy to go in and out of Medill, too. Medill is very writing heavy, and this is very reading heavy, very analytical, but also made me question everything, which is something that I didn't do. I think helped my journalism, too. Was making me question why with a lot of things. That's something that I didn't do a lot before, and something that's really helped me in my journalism now. So that's why I did it.
Thank you. I know me as well as other Black students have expressed how African American Studies very much feel like a safe space for us. So, yeah. My next question is for Gretchen McLennan, class of '97. Gretchen McLennan was named president and CEO of Ballet Memphis in August of 2020. In 2017, Gretchen founded her consulting practice, DI Studio, to leverage over 15 years in the philanthropic and nonprofit sectors. Gretchen's facilitation supports organizations in optimizing their capacity and program practices in innovative ways. She's worked with clients in Minneapolis, Atlanta, Chicago, and Wisconsin on projects ranging from strategic planning to leadership coaching and organization cultural realignment. And so my question is, so since you lead an arts organization, let's bring in a little Black culture here. So during the mid to late 1990s, when you were a student, The best-selling Black music hall artists were Usher, Mary J. Blige, Janet Jackson, Puff, Biggie, Destiny's Child, and so many more. So Tupac passed in 96, and Biggie Smalls passed in 97. So what were you all talking about in your African American Studies courses in the 90s? Did the students and faculty bring any contemporary Black culture into the classroom?
Yeah, I loved receiving this question because it did take me back. And, you know, in some ways, when I took a step back and thought about it, I was like, it felt like that time in Black culture was in many ways an apex or evolutionary apex of Black culture, right? That time between 1985 and maybe 2000 approximately, because you list all the music, but when I think about all the film and our representation on television, it almost felt like a moment in time where we were culturally firing on all cylinders from a representation standpoint. And I'm at this campus in that moment in time where I think me and my cohort, we felt like we were seen. And it wasn't a given, but in many ways it was a given. It was like we knew the generations and the folks that came before us, obviously in our minds then mainly thinking about our parents and our aunts and our uncles, that they had worked so hard to get us to that point where, right, we could be on a campus like this and name and claim our space righteously and boldly, but also not having to struggle to always do that, right? We felt like, yes, this is ours too in many ways, and that's a huge privilege, but that was the truth of the moment. And so I think the culture, Black culture, was probably a lens that galvanized conversation, but I don't recall a whole lot of it being part of a formative part of conversation and dialogue, but it was certainly in the ether. It was part of the energy. It was interesting. I think maybe it was Charles mentioning about enrollment in African American studies during the time period. And so to take you back, yes, I was here for Charles Payne, Leon Forrest, Adolph Reed, Sandra, and then all these amazing visiting professors. And so the department was really just, in many ways, just the thing. So much so that all my classes were always full, many times by students of color and Black students primarily, but also by white students. I was shocked when I got to graduation and there was only 3 of us. I did not know that there were only 3 people graduating in the department because I witnessed, and I bore witness to classes that were full all the time, and many people, not just Black people, grappling with the dialogue and the discourse of the time. And so, yeah, I think culture and the cultural moment probably, in some classes, I specifically remember, obviously as it related to gender, a lot of Sandra's, the conversations in those classes, really digging deep around issues of gender and sexual identity. And certainly culture played a part in that discussion for many of us. But I think it was a backdrop, but one that I probably took for granted because once again, it felt like, yeah, of course, this culture is American culture. And so in many ways I was like, yeah, but it definitely was part of a formative part of the background noise that kind of fueled dialogue in the department for sure.
Okay, were there any events during your time at undergrad that stick out in your mind surrounding Black culture or just your intellectual development around African American studies?
Around African American studies, going to Freaknik, driving down to Freaknik with all my friends. I mean, you said on campus. Sorry, I was on the tail end of the latter years of Freaknik. Yeah, hashtag Freaknik, R.I.P. You know what, for me, it was my time, I don't know if we still have AAT, the African American Theater Ensemble, but, at the time that, group of us that performed from the African American theater canon several times a year on this campus, that was an important part of my time at Northwestern, and that organization was so active, and we really literally and figuratively had the stage regularly on this campus. And it was a very formative part of my identity beyond being obviously a part of this department. But once again, kudos to the faculty and staff of this department because I never felt like this department was an also-ran. I didn't know it was the redheaded stepchild of this university, if it was ever one, and it sounds like in many ways it has been and may still struggle to name and claim a space, both here at a localized level, but also when we think about academic institutions writ large and African American Studies departments. So, once again, I give them a lot of credit for creating a place and a space where I had no idea about the fight for resources, and because we were resource rich in terms of the talent and the expertise that was in front of the classroom and engaging with us on a day-to-day basis. But I would say probably for me, there was no cataclysmic moment on campus that I can name that I'm thinking of. Sitting here talking to Tori, I was here for our Rose Bowl years, so it was really a halcyon time on the campus in many ways, but probably for me, the African American Theater Ensemble played a huge role in defining me, and certainly helped me as I thought through how I could still play a role in the space around theater and culture and the arts without necessarily having to be a theater major.
Okay, thank you so much. My next question is for Tori. So you work in a very corporate setting. Is there any room for your training in African American studies in these settings? And what would you say are the challenges and opportunities of having an AFAM degree in your work world?
That's a good question. So I guess I'll answer it backwards. I'll answer the second question first. I feel like it's the easier one to answer. It was probably one of the reasons why I didn't major. I was 2 classes short of double majoring in African American studies, and part of it is that you're already on a predominantly white institution, right? And you're an African American, and it somehow discounts the fact that you're majoring in African American studies as if it's not a real major. And so as a result of that, I allowed that fear to prevent me from moving forward and doing so. And it's kind of the same thing as far as the corporate world is concerned. I work in an environment, I work for BP, the energy company, so a lot of engineer majors, right? And so to walk in and you're talking to all these people who are mainly business majors, engineer majors, and talk about African American studies, they kind of look at you like you're lost, right? But for me, what it did for me, it gave me agency, right? It gave me identity. So I came from Robbins, Illinois, familiar with the area, so on the south side of Chicago, very impoverished, poor Black community. So coming up to Northwestern was like this big culture shock to me. And so immediately I felt homesick. I didn't feel like I belonged. And really African American Studies is the one place where I felt like I could take up space, and it felt like home. And so being on an athletic scholarship, I was a football player here. I was drawn to a class called Sports in the African American Experience, which was taught by Professor Biondi, who was just phenomenal. And I could go on and on about what she's meant for me. But I took that class, and it kind of explored the impact of sports, and particularly sports figures, on the progression of the civil rights movement. And so that kind of lit a fire in me, and I thought about, I've always saw myself as a change agent, and how can I be more proactive in what I'm doing? And so fast forward beyond, graduation, I went back, and as I was training for the NFL, I was working in Bronzeville in Chicago at a homeless shelter for teenagers. And in that time frame, and just trying to peel back layers, I was 22 at the time, and the oldest client there was 21. But our mindsets could have been separated in light years, it's just in his mentality and mine. And so I thought, okay, we both were raised in similar environment, right? Projects outside Chicago, single parent home, another parent on drugs, very similar. What separated me and brought me back here as a worker, and this person being here as a client. And for me, it was all about exposure and the lack of exposure, right? And so I went off to Northwestern, even only a 40-minute drive from my house, but now I'm surrounded by people from 33 different countries. And we're having all these philosophical conversations about life that this individual had not been exposed to. And so when you live in an environment that's very homogeneous, where people walk, talk, act the same way as you, do you ever question your beliefs? No. So I didn't realize how much of my identity was tied to my environment until I was removed from it, and then was able to explore it in that way. And that's what African American Studies provided for me. And so that led me to write my first book called Impoverished State of Mind, which the premise is just that being impoverished is more than just a socioeconomic status, it's a state of mind. And beyond the absence of money and other necessities and resources, it's this mindset that prevents a lot of people from being able to rise above their circumstances. And so all of that is rooted in my time, and that started here, and it's just continued to progress from that point going forward.
Yeah, I know you mentioned. Oh, I'm sorry. I know you mentioned how when you would say you were an African American Studies minor, people would kind of look at you funny. And I know there's still kind of that stigma today around in African American studies, like what can you do with that going forward? And so that's why we really need events like this to show like how many distinguished alumni we have with an African American studies degree or major. So thank you so much. My next question is for Dana Nixon. So all professors seem to want students to get a PhD, and you got one. So, so was going to graduate school at all motivated by your African American Studies coursework? Did you do research as an undergrad, and what led you to the PhD?
Thank you for your question, and thank you, Dr. Patillo, for the invitation, and all the students and staff who made today possible, and faculty members too. So just grateful to be here. These questions prompted me to reflect, and I'm really grateful for that because I finished my PhD in 2020, and I don't think I've really kind of thought deeply amidst transitions and COVID, like, how did I get here? You know, it was kind of like one thing to the next and just trying to make a way. So when I came to Northwestern, I moved here from the suburbs of Dallas, and most of the folks who had gone to college in my family went to HBCUs. So there was a general kind of distrust in my family, like, where are you going? Like, why are you going up there? Like, what's Northwestern? And there's like, you know, like, why don't you go to Howard? Why don't you go here? All these places. So on top of that, I think I was generally not as prepared as many of my peers who were coming into Northwestern. And so I was lost, you know, I was trying to find a way here and find something that felt like home. I was holding these narratives from my family. And just realizing, like, I don't know how to write yet. I'm trying to learn how to read all these things. And it really was just, it felt comforting. And I hesitate to say this, to put this on Black women, but to be in African American studies classes, because folks like Sandra Richards, Mary Patillo, Tracy Vaughn, they were these women who were strong and brilliant and rigorous and kind and no nonsense at the same time. And it made me feel safe. Like, it made me feel like this is a place where I can be. And I also really loved the intentional connections between intellectual study and the community. And so I think I was trying to figure out, what does it mean to be in this very white elite space, and also try to have some connections with my family and my community, and those classes facilitated those conversations for me. I could talk to my family about what we were discussing in classes. Some of the classes had these exploratory experiential components where we went to stuff on the South Side. So it just felt like a place I could be me. And to get to the PhD thing, I think that kind of stayed with me as I continued to progress in my graduate studies, just being, wanting to be in this space where I could learn and like pursue my passions and explore these different bodies of knowledge. But how do I do this in a way that doesn't separate me from the people I love the most, or do it in a way that just feels disconnected from Black communities? And so African American studies really grounded that for me. And I went on to focus on education foundations and policy. And in African American studies classes, that was the first place I read Charles Payne's book. That was the first time I think one of the classes we read Education of Blacks in the South by James Anderson. And so, it was the first place I really was exposed to these traditions of Black education, communal-led education, and not just this crisis narrative, that we too often get around Black schooling in the US. So it just planted so many different seeds for me that I didn't realize at the time, but kind of carried me and gave me some purpose in my studies.
Thank you. And so these next few questions are open to anyone to answer. So who would you all say were the staff people who supported the African American Studies department during your era, and how, or like professors who supported you in your studies?
I'll go first again, and a lot, right? But I can speak to two that are staring at me right now, and Professor Patillo and Professor Biondi. Took classes, several classes with both, and it was beyond just feeling like, there were, physics classes and other classes that I took where, you just kind of feel like another number. And that's the one thing I liked about the African American Studies department, that I never felt that way. You felt like there were people who were invested in your success, and they were willing to give their time and really work with you. Like someone else said, I don't know who it was, but I felt behind the 8 ball. I mean, I was a straight A student, but I was at a public school on the south side of Chicago. Everybody that went to school, it felt like went to private school. So I'm like, well, for $20,000 a year, I would hope you've been exposed to more curriculum than I was for free. But it was a bit intimidating. And so having those people in your corner really was instrumental in my early years at Northwestern.
I can go. I'll say Professor Hesse. He was somebody who really, really challenged me to be the best version of myself and to always think farther than what I initially thought. And I think sometimes it used to like really get on my nerves that he would make me do that. Like I used to get really frustrated sometimes. But I think like he always was willing to look out for me, make sure that I was really thinking deeper than what I could have. And I think sometimes I even thought I couldn't think deeper than I could. And then he would have a breakthrough. He'd kind of just look at me and smile, and I was like, dang, he got me again. Like, he used to get on my but the one thing about the African American Studies department, too, that I didn't feel in other departments here is with, like, office hours, the thing, like, you kind of have to reach out to the professor to find a time, but with the professors, they always wanted to make time for you. Out of their days, they would reach out to you, tell you, hey, come in at this time. Like, please make time. Like, if you're writing an essay, like, I want to meet with you just so I can get to know you, talk to you, and know who you are. And that's something that is very small but very important. That's something that made me feel like that, which kept me in the department. I feel like for as long as I did, I think is because of that sense of community and feeling like there were professors who genuinely wanted to get to know who you were and reach out to you. So I think those are the people, Professor Hesse in particular, and Professor Von Manley as well. But I could really name any professor whose class I took, and I could be like that person had an impact on me as well.
What is a moment from an AFAM class that still sticks with you? It could be funny, tense, inspirational, eye-opening.
So I don't even know if I was thinking of it as an African American Studies class, but the freshman seminar that I chose was Black Chicago with Dr. Mary Patillo. And you had planned a day on the south side of Chicago, and we were doing a stepping class, right? And I just remember how fun it was. Like, we were having a good time, and just like, what has been said already, like, it was a lot of Black students in the class. These are people who you're hanging out with in the dorms and, building friendships with in other spaces. But just to have that opportunity to kind of bridge from a classroom space to your social space and to other political spaces you might be involved in. But it was a fun day. And I remember I was trying to step, and and Mary, you said to me, you need to look up and close your mouth. And I just was like, oh, but I think like kind of going, and I thought I was like, doing something. And so I just remember that day. We had great food, and to that point, like the kindness and no nonsense, like, and just the authenticity of the faculty members in African American Studies stays with me, because just the time it takes to plan that day, and to commit a Saturday all day to be with students, and just the honesty, right? Like, I'm gonna try to help you do this correctly. We're not just out here doing it to do it. So that day stays with me.
Mine's more an anecdote, just because we were reminiscing, and I think just hearing so many of these names again today, one of the things I always remember was when it was time for the verdict for the O.J. Simpson trial. And we were in Norris, and I was standing next to Leon Forrest. I just happened to wander in. I think the quarter had just started, so it was kind of one of those, hey, good to see you, catching up, but the tension was in the air. It was very palpable. And I remember being on the ground floor where, the food services and the bookstore, and they had all the television screens turned to it, and you could hear a pin drop. It was that tense. And I remember getting the verdict, and in real time they showed those split screens, the notorious split screen of some African Americans hearing the verdict and overwhelmingly white folks somewhere hearing the verdict. And I remember when they showed the bifurcation and the different responses, and I remember him muttering under his breath, and he goes, well, this is gonna be a problem. And how true those words were, but I mean, once again, not really, but I just always vividly remember standing next to him, and us being like, holy crap. All right, here we go. Yeah.
Wow. I know this year we've had some of us students have had the opportunity to have dinner with a few African American Studies professors, such as Professor Patillo and Professor Kiana Ross, and that was I would say great bonding time for us to get to know the professors better, and so I just love opportunities like that. And I would say an AFAM class that sticks out to me is when I took, I believe it was called Black Masculinity with Professor Marquise Bay. That class was amazing because, like you were saying, I think that was you that was saying that, I'm sorry. I knew so many students in the class that it just felt like home. Conversation was so easy, and yeah. So what did you talk about in your AFAM courses that you knew you couldn't talk about anywhere else?
Well, still a topic that's difficult to discuss even in the corporate world is racism. So we talked a lot about that, and that's something that we're navigating even right now. So I'm one of the few African Americans who will head a department at BP, and even though I work for an energy company right now, my background is actually in the rail industry. And when you look at the history of America, it's one of the oldest industries around, the rail industry. So it's still very much predominantly white male led and very much a good old boy industry. And so the topic of racism can become very difficult and very touchy. So that being said, that was something that we talked about frequently in some of our classes here at Northwestern. It's something that I don't shy away from. It's always from the lens of trying to understand others, but also trying to create a conversation versus teach, right? Everybody's coming from their own perspective, right? And their perspective is being shaped by their own upbringing and life experiences. And even though I may not agree with their perspective, it's impossible to be able to have a conversation if it's going to just be one-sided or if you just see it as an opportunity for you to be able to teach.
I remember some really challenging conversations around class. And that was really probably one of the first times I had been in a space and a place where, behind closed doors, we could really dig deep on some of these issues. Sandra Richards, I remember we had a seminar that it was small. It was 12 of us, and it was primarily black women in that seminar. And there was raised voices. I mean, we really would challenge and push each other because many of us were coming from second generation college-educated households, upper middle class black households, and the dynamics of being in these environments where now all of a sudden we're confronting stereotypes and tropes and perceptions around blackness that may be anathema to our personal experience, but was certainly shared experience of our culture and people. We could get into a room and it felt safe to really say, push each other on some, even now, like you said, uncomfortable conversations and ones that are sometimes hard to broach no matter what African American Studies department itself, but certainly some of these seminars offered a time and a place where we could really, like I said, for the first time, I think I could be challenged on those things, but also feel comfortable stating or engaging in dialogue on some of these issues where I'd never had that opportunity before, and probably never since in that kind of way, because once again, it was layered. Frederick, I think you said this at lunch today, because it always, the material and always guided the discussion, right? So the rigor of the discussion was always based in history and literature, and was informed discussion that may at times have gotten emotional, but it was one where there was, I guess we had a sense of trust that we were all coming from a place and a perspective that was born of that duality of both the rigor but also lived experience that was really impactful to me, yeah.
How would you all say that you use your experience in African American Studies at Northwestern outside of your work and in your communities, families, and organizational activities?
So I recently moved to Seattle in July of 2021, and I did not want to move to Seattle, y'all. I was just like, I do not want to go here, but this is making the most sense professionally, and I guess I'm just not gonna have a personal life. But I think, after COVID granted me some time, because I was able to go home to Texas and spend some time with family before I had to move, because we were remote for a year. And I think it allowed me to kind of process that this is going to happen. And so, I think after I was able to kind of step back and process, I was like, okay, Black people are in Seattle, are in the Pacific Northwest, and they are in community, and they are doing important work, and they are loving each other, and they are finding joy. And so you could do that too. And so I think just like at a kind of base level African, like I had to go back to remember we're everywhere. And we, not only are we everywhere, but we organize ourselves, we look after ourselves. And so, I think my grounding, in African American Studies helped me to get there, and on a really kind of basic level. And I ended up choosing to live in the Central District, which is the historic area of Seattle where Black folks have largely been gentrified out, but it also has helped me to connect with different organizations, just find Black folks in a white city. And then I also want to just say too, with my family, my grandparents, my maternal grandparents were educators. And so also just, taking African American Studies classes helped me to understand, like I was saying earlier, this long tradition of Black educators that we see in any and all communities. And so being able to ask them and kind of try to capture that history for our family. How did you become an educator? What decisions did you make? What was your leadership like? And especially as I work in education. So, growing up, I knew they were educators, but I don't think I really understood the tradition that they worked within.
I would say for me, with my family, I know, so my mom took over, she's like the chief diversity officer of a hospital, and she took over in 2020. So I feel like as I grew in college and learned about African American studies, my mom kind of grew as well. We kind of both talked about a lot of different topics that were happening in real time in her life, and also while I'm also kind of learning about concepts and topics in school. And I thought it was really beneficial for me. I kind of stuck with the rest of my family too, with my dad, my grandparents. We also had a lot of conversations, but I think my mom in particular, especially given she took over the role I think it was February of 2020, so then the pandemic happens, then George Floyd and everything happened. You can imagine what that was like for her. I think having those conversations about a wide range of topics and bringing her making me question things, me making her question things that I learned in class about. I mean, one of the classes that I really enjoyed here was the social meaning of race with Professor Patillo, and that was one of my favorite classes that I took here. Just questioning implicit bias that we have in society and how that shows up in healthcare with my mom's work too. It's actually kind of a funny memory now I'm thinking about it, but it was in your class we were talking about how sometimes people capitalize the W in white but not the B in black, and how it's a common thing. People will say blacks and then white people, so insinuating that that black people aren't or like kind of inhumane or not equal to white people. And I remember we all basically had to write our papers on this, and I remember we got it back, and Professor Patel was like, yeah, you guys all did a good job, but some of you guys made the same exact mistake that we just talked about in class. And I remember like all of us kind of looking at each other and be like, oh my God, was it me? And we all like pulled out our computers and tried to figure out who did it. But I just remember like, I didn't do it, just for the record. But but yeah, just like having those topics, thinking about things that, implicit bias, things you wouldn't think about. And I think it really has helped my mom, my dad, and I kind of grow in a lot of those topics as well, like in their jobs and in my job now too.
Yeah, I would say it's influenced every aspect and every facet of my activism, right? And whether it's in my writings, I do a lot of writing on the topic, right? Just to try to challenge the status quo. One was called Urban and Suburban: Why Blacks Fleeing Black Communities Must Cease, talking about the gentrification of blacks throughout, it was specifically talking about the city of Chicago, but even abroad. Just in my mentorship, so I believe in trying to pay it forward. And so in me, I a famous Tupac interview where he talked about not being the one. Well, I might not be the one, but he said the energy and the passion I'm gonna speak with when I talk to everyone, I may spark the mind of the next person who's gonna do it. And so I do that in terms of my mentorship, and then even in organizing. So like I'm with a coalition right now who's working to bring about some changes for the Northwestern football program to provide more support to the black athletes. And then even in my old school district, my high school district, it is a third white, a third black, a third Hispanic. However, the faculty is 90.5% white, and it's been that way for over 2 decades. And so when you look at disciplinary actions and all the different fallouts of that, it's all showing why it's an issue. And so we're pushing to basically bring about change in that area to diversify the faculty. So in turn, to be able to change some of the negative impacts we're seeing in terms of referrals, detentions, and disciplinary actions against black and brown students.
So I know 2020 was a very tumultuous time, to say the very least, but with your background in AFAM, how did you approach any conversations around George Floyd or Black Lives Matter with your coworkers or family or friends, would you say?
2020 was interesting for me personally because I came into leadership of a ballet company in 2020. So being a woman of color, coming into leadership of being a unicorn, frankly, coming into leadership of a white institution in a white ecosystem that's born 500 years in the making, but also grappling long before George Floyd, but certainly not long enough before George Floyd with these issues around race and representation. A lot of things were coming to a head in 2020, and even at our level, we had a former dancer we had not offered a contract back to. This is right before I joined the team, who we had not offered a contract to, and he had made a video that went viral. Misty Copeland gave him, everyone was giving him feedback and giving him oh, I can't believe that emoji, and fight the good fight. Support, but he basically said this ballet company, proclaims to be the most diverse, classical ballet company in America, but in fact, is not. And he felt that his time there, he had been cast in ways that felt like they were, he was cast above his pay grade almost, that he was asked to take on roles that he would not have been cast in were he not a black man, but that he felt that the staff and leadership of the ballet company had put him in a place and made him, in many ways, a show pony. And it was a challenging time for the institution. It was a challenging time, like I said, for the legacy arts ecosystem that I was coming into. And so, for me, my goal in that time and going to, both my education here, but my experience and just my confidence, my competence in this space, my goal was to be transparent about our need for evolution and engaging in conversation and more importantly, being intentional about putting a framework together and doing the work towards making, towards doing better in this space. So acknowledging that whether or not anything he said not so much was true, but was in fact the intention or what in fact happened behind the scenes, it didn't matter. If that's his perspective, then that's the truth. And so we will embrace that and acknowledge it, and we will also acknowledge the fact that we have a lot of work to do as an institution to move forward. So for me, it was about being transparent. It was also encouraging my brothers and sisters who are not Black or people of color to lead the conversation and to start getting comfortable being uncomfortable doing so. And so our artistic director is a Scottish man, and he had been encouraged by past leadership to begin taking on and bridging and broaching some of those conversations and leading them. And with facilitated support, I encouraged the same thing from him because, for him, for me, it was very much being very, from a maybe very visual perspective, it to be very clear that it wasn't just going to be, that I wasn't part of, it just so happened that I was coming into leadership during this time, but that the goal here wasn't to have a Black woman to continue to lead the discussion as always has happened historically, but also encourage other people that may not normally have been part of that discussion or force themselves to be in those spaces to grapple with those issues to be front and center along with me. And so I'm not sure if we got it right. For me, at the time, it was really about stabilizing our organizational culture, and our DEI work has been front and center of that. But I know that we've made a lot of inroads. We've put a lot of things in place. We're very intentional about our work in that. But I know we have a lot to do, and at times it can feel very overwhelming. And so, having a clear rubric around how we are moving the needle and hopefully informing larger transformation in classical ballet would be the goal. But for us, I'm more keenly aware, and it's more important for me from a legacy perspective to really inform how this classical ballet company in an overwhelmingly Black city shows up. And so that's where I spend most of my energy.
The only thing I would say really quickly is that, in the aftermath of George Floyd's death, it presented a unique opportunity to have difficult conversations on the topic of racism that previously in the corporate world was considered taboo and you could not touch. And so being in leadership and senior level leadership within a company, you're kind of one of the few Blacks in the room. And so the expectation is always for you to kind of step in and speak on behalf of the entire race, as if we one voice, one sound. So that being said, we had these listening sessions where we basically just, instead of having conversations about business or what have you, people dialed in, and you just had different people, African Americans, speak about situations that they dealt with similarly to like George Floyd's. And so for me, I was irritated by the listening sessions. I didn't think they were doing much of anything other except for people pouring out their hearts, crying and really emotionally and worked up over this. And it's like, for what reason, right? So you're having them do this, and it felt like for show, but really where's the action behind it? And so I processed it and thought about how could I approach this differently? And so I ended up writing a letter, open letter, to my CEO who sits in London, and sent it to him and then published it to LinkedIn, which got 60,000 views, and forced him to have to respond to it. So I told the story of my grandmother and the sharecropping South, picking cotton and having to drop out of school in the 6th grade, all the way coming through the Great Migration into Chicago and being boxed in by redlining, and really just tried to explain to them that the history that we think is so distant is really not that far. And so doing so, I had a list of kind of requests, more like demands towards the end of it. And thankfully, I didn't get fired, because a lot of people are like, hey, you might not want to go down this path. And I did, but there were a couple things that came out of it. One, I asked for transparency. So we had this thing of talking about diversity and talking about minorities as all together as one. But so we would look at our numbers, and we would say, well, our minority numbers are going up, but it would be heavily weighted on Asian Americans, and we would never separate it out to see Hispanics or blacks being a lower population of the total. And so one thing they're doing is now publishing a full diversity report that breaks out minorities on the individual level for each subgroup. And the other thing was about tying diversity numbers to pay. You know, money talks, right? And so at each group level, leaders level, they now have a diversity component and metrics to be able to get to a specific number. Otherwise, it impacts their pay and their bonus. And so, again, where I could have been afraid to speak up, it actually led to a lot of good things that positively to come out of it. So if I could leave anyone with anything, was to be, if you feel led to do something, even if it may seem crazy to you, if you feel really genuinely led to do so, do it. Go ahead and do it. And I tell myself I'm married to a cause, not a company. And so if this company is gonna fire me because I'm speaking freely about something I feel passionate about, then it's probably not the company for me anyway.
So my last question for you all is what advice you would give to students majoring or minoring in African American studies, and what do you wish you might have done differently in college?
I'll be quick and just say that I wish I would have majored in African American studies. I mean, let's be honest. I'm being honest with you, because if I was being my true authentic self that I am now, I was too afraid to be that person back then because I was still growing and I was going through this identity crisis. But I can tell you wholeheartedly right now, if I could do it all over again, I absolutely would have. I probably would be at HBCU too, but that's a whole nother discussion.
I'll add, the opportunity to study abroad in Ghana was just a life-affirming experience for me, and an ability to actually see the studies around the African diaspora, see it in real time, and to see similarities and differences, to learn about the history of the transatlantic slave trade, that to me kind of put the bow on my time in African American studies. So I would just encourage current students to look into study abroad programs that can complement your learning in the classroom here. I also would just encourage you to ask for what you need. So this is kind of an aside, but also similar, because I know African American studies attracts a lot of Black students, and as a professor now, I am realizing how little I ask for. The emails I get from students, and I'm like, people were asking for these things? Are people, and I'm not saying we need to swing to the other side and become, outlandish in our requests, but just to find the confidence to ask faculty members, staff members, people around the university, what you need to make this experience right and valuable for you.
I hadn't even been gone for a year, so I don't have a ton of advice. But I would say definitely take a class with every teacher here. If you can, try to take a class with as many different teachers as you can, because they're going to give you some different perspectives on things you haven't thought of before. And also take a class that you know absolutely nothing about. If you see something what in the world does that mean? Take it, because you're gonna grow in that area in some sort of way. So that's my advice.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us here today. We're gonna We're going to wrap this panel up, but next up we will have Professor of African American Studies Alex Wehelia, and he will introduce our next panelist of accomplished alumni.
So as our panel is switching, this is not a break, we just have a switch here. I do just want to let folks know that the live stream is live. Folks are having a big old conversation on the live stream, and so we want to maybe invite the folks on the live stream if they have any questions for the next panel, to go ahead. We have somebody in the room who can call our attention. So live streamers, feel free to put a question on the table for the next panel if you wish, and we're just happy that you all are having a good time on there. So yes, I'll invite the next panel up, and we'll move straight to it.